Good morning and welcome to another edition of Page One Power's panel webinars. Today we'll be discussing enterprise technical SEO. I'm joined by Tom Anthony, Paul Shapiro, Patrick Stox. We'll go through and introduce one by one who these gentlemen are in just a moment. We are broadcasting live today from Boise, Idaho. Beautiful fall colors are setting in. Sunrise is happening as we speak, and I'm having my first cup of coffee. Good morning. Tom Anthony is the head of R&D from Distilled. Tom, you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do at Distilled.
Absolutely. Hi. So I've been at Distilled for just over 5 years now, and so I used to do consulting for about 3 years and ran the consulting team here in London. And we worked with a variety of companies, from small companies to sort of enterprise scale global companies. And nowadays, for the last couple of years, I've been running the R&D team, where my prime focus is building a split testing platform for SEO called Distilled ODN. So we're starting to see customers get some successes out of that. So it's a sort of exciting new era of SEO from my perspective, using this data-driven methodology.
Right. I'm very well familiar with ODN. If anyone in the audience is not, I highly recommend checking it out. If someone's running our Twitter account right now, you should tweet out a link about Distilled's ODN, which I'm sure we'll discuss further in depth through this webinar. It's pretty fantastic and interesting new approach to data-driven technical SEO. Thanks for joining us today, Tom.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is the esteemed Paul Shapiro, at Phyto on Twitter. He's the Director of Strategy and Innovation at Catalyst. Paul, thank you for joining us today. Tell us a little bit about what you do at Catalyst.
Thank you for having me today.
Yes.
Sure. So Catalyst is a search and social agency in North America. We have offices all over the country and in Canada. And myself, I have a background in SEO, so I try to focus more on coming with new innovative strategies, working technology across discipline, and trying to really develop what we can do in that means in terms of building out a more efficient tech stack.
Cool. Well, I'm really stoked to have you on the webinar today. I've read a lot of your brilliant technical SEO ideas and approaches to how you do your work over on the Search Wilderness site that you run. So really appreciate you coming on the webinar today, Paul. Thanks.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Patrick Stox. You have probably read a lot of his musings across the web on search engine land about technical SEO. I especially appreciated your response to the technical SEO is just makeup piece. So tell us a little bit about what you do in your role as an SEO specialist within the WASO team.
Well, I moved off that team. It's a new team, Technical SEO specialist at IBM, and basically work with every business unit and try and put out as many fires as I can.
I'm sure that's fascinating within an organization at the scale of IBM, fighting in the name of SEO.
Yeah, it's super interesting.
Cool. Well, I hope to hear much more about that as we go on through this webinar. So let's jump into it. Thank you, Patrick, for joining us today.
Hey, thank you for having me.
I am Nicholas Chimonas. I'm your moderator today. I'm the head of research and development at Page One Power. I kind of serve a similar role as Paul Shapiro in terms of trying to make our processes at our company better, but I also head up technical SEO projects within our client base. Let's jump into our actual webinar. Question 1. Enterprise sites have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pages. How do you prioritize and manage technical issues at this scale? Patrick, let's lead off with you.
Okay, I would say just hit where you're going to make a decent impact. At that scale, page by page, unless it's one of the really important pages, isn't going to make much difference. But at the same time, sometimes you just have to do the page by page and get some small wins to really get the trust to tackle bigger projects, different, for us, I'd say tackling issues with different CMS systems and, different business units one at a time, so that we can build up like case studies and kind of show impact to others. It's the way we try and go about it.
You find that you have an easier time getting buy-in if you've proven your case within a smaller subsection of the site. Then you can roll that out and have the firepower to convince the development team to do that at a larger scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Or development teams in our case.
Sure. Okay. Paul, what are your thoughts on this? We also have an audience a question from the audience. If you'd like to touch on that, they asked, how do you optimize for crawl budget for enterprise clients at this scale of pages?
Let me tackle the main question first. I think really it comes down to being able to assess the impact of any changes you're going to make. So that means you guys should be building out models, forecasting the impact, specking out the cost of people, resources, technology, anything you're going to need to actually implement those changes on millions and millions of pages. And then from there, you should be able to prioritize accordingly. Once you know what things are going to cost and what it's going to take to get there, it's a simple I prioritize this over this over this, and it should be a lot easier to tackle in that respect.
Sure.
In terms of the crawl budget question, I'm a big fan of, I wrote an article on search engine land and about using the PageRank algorithm and calculating that across your website internally. So you can actually really use that to impact your crawl budget. Something with a higher PageRank is going to be prioritized when a crawler comes to it.
Sure, and I think that's an approach that is really neglected pretty frequently, actually trying to get some data behind why you think this change in architecture is going to make the change you expect. Thanks for answering that, Paul.
No problem.
Tom, what are your thoughts on this? I know you probably have an interesting perspective in how you approach this, especially in terms of using the ODN. So feel free to touch on that too.
Absolutely. So so firstly, I agree with both Patrick and Paul. Like Patrick touched on, you can't do things at page by page level, not at that scale, and Paul talked about assessing the impact. And I think you need to, the combination of both those things is trying to understand what areas of the site are going to have the highest ROI. Which of these problems are going to have the highest ROI in terms of fixing them? So you not only need to have like your hypothesis of, okay, this fix is going to require this level of effort. You need to talk to the devs about what they're going to require. You need to understand the payoff and the longevity. So an example of a bad case is something which is going to take the devs so long to get to that by the time the payoff comes around, it's no longer worth it. So an example I have is where we had a client who took almost 2 years to roll out some structured markup onto the site. That was right when rich snippets were really getting going, and they were a retail client and a retail company, sorry, and a B2C retail company, and they could have benefited from that sort of golden period of rich snippets so well, but we didn't adequately understand how long it would take the devs to do it. By the time they got around to actually rolling it out, it was a long dead thing. So you need to identify which areas of your site are actually viable to work on when you're working with an enterprise client, and then understand how quickly can we get stuff shipped. In terms of ODN, one of the exciting things from our perspective is it goes back to what Paul was saying about having like a hypothesis of what's going to have any impact. So now we start off with looking at the backlog, because there's normally for any enterprise client a long list of SEO changes that is on a backlog that's going to need some level of prioritization. But often you can say, okay, this is a big piece of work, this is a small piece of work, but it's hard to assess the exact payoff you're going to get. So we're now encouraging more and more people to do testing, A, because we've got a platform for doing it, but B, because with testing methodology, whether you're using distilled ODN or anything else, it's surprising how difficult it has been to adequately predict the ROI of a certain activity. And so we're seeing changes as simple as changing H1s and title tags having a far greater impact than we might have actually guessed.
Right.
And so as soon as you start using a test-driven methodology, you start realizing, okay, well, we can just taste test these tiny little changes, and you'll be quite surprised at what changes are the ones that are going to be impactful, but also easier to ship.
And I think that's especially true at this level of scale. When you're dealing with a site that is millions of URLs, simple changes, the smaller changes have a larger impact than you really might expect. And, I think it's maybe the pendulum has swung a little too far in terms of on-page SEO doesn't mean anything. And I don't think that's really true. I think it means even more the larger the site you're working with, typically.
Absolutely, absolutely. A really great post by Mike King on Moz.
Tom, I think you're cutting out a little bit there. Were you talking about the recent Mike King Moz post? I think
I was saying King on Moz and talking about the tech.
Shoot. Well, Tom, you might want to try reconnecting. We're getting a little bit of breakup here. I think I was picking up what you were saying about the most recent Moz blog post by Mike King, the Technical SEO Renaissance. He's been speaking about that at a couple of conferences lately, which is making a really good point that even our SEO tools are somewhat behind the game in terms of picking up, only recently Screaming Frog updated that we could, I guess past half year, it's able to render JavaScript now. Whereas in the past, if we were to crawl an Angular site, you wouldn't pick up the rendered code. And, a lot of our tools are behind the game. They're not checking for canonicals in the headers, for example. They don't have an ability to do that. So if you're just relying on your tool, not checking your headers, you might think there's no canonical, and there really is. And so it's an interesting post. I'd recommend checking it out, that really technical SEO and on-page SEO and all of that is more important than it ever has been. So let's move on to the next question. Hopefully we'll have Tom back here in a moment with better connection. In the meantime, we'll bounce to someone else. Question number 2, working with enterprise clients means a slower implementation cycle. How do you plan accordingly? Patrick, let's go back to you for this one.
That's a fun question. Sometimes, yeah, you're waiting. Some of the fixes that and changes I want to make, I don't expect to happen this year, and maybe not even next year. But there's plenty of other stuff to do. But it's not always like that. Like, I want to point out, like, people really think that enterprise just moves slow, but it's not always the case. If you have exec buy-in, if you have team buy-in, we just did like a major restructuring in the cloud version of our site for a conference that's going on right now, actually, World of Watson. And we did it in less than 2 months. And I mean, if I was scoping this project, I would have said, 9 months minimum. But we got it done, and the team is already on to another major project already. Like, it's not always slow. It depends on, if you have the buy-in, if you have the motivated team, things can get done pretty quick.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced both sides of the coin, and I think you're absolutely right. It depends at what level of the organization you have buy-in as well that can push it through and actually make it happen more quickly.
Absolutely.
I think oftentimes when you're on the other side of the coin where things are going slow or your recommendations are never being implemented, it's because you haven't earned trust yet. You haven't earned that buy-in by proving yourself. They don't know how impactful some of these changes really could be. Once you can get it rolled out, perhaps like the suggestion earlier, in a smaller subsection of the site, and you've proven this is important, let's do this, then it oftentimes becomes a faster implementation cycle. So, Paul, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, oftentimes you really can't do anything about it. It's going to be a slow process. What you can do is sometimes you have an opportunity where you can implement things yourself. It's not always the case, and sometimes it doesn't happen at all. But if you have that opportunity where you can implement a change yourself, I think that will help speed things along, especially so that, I mean, on the analytics end, like there are things like Google Tag Manager and other tag management that could help in that respect, because then you don't even have to touch the client's website. So any little thing that you can sort of implement yourself is going to help speed that process along. Also, I think just making sure you're clearly communicating the value of these changes is going to help. Talking to the right people. I think having a strong tech team, because if you're a strong tech team, you are able to build trust with developers, with an engineering team, and that really helps you say, well, I know this change is not going to be so substantial on your end, or I can even help out in that respect, and you can get things done a little bit better just by knowing what you're doing.
That's a really good point. I mean, being willing to take the reins and actually be supportive of the developer too, being empathetic to their bandwidth and the fact that you're asking them to, tack on this many more hours worth of work. I've found that it's absolutely true. If you make yourself available, or you offer, I have the ability to make these changes if I get access to X. Oftentimes just getting access is easier than getting on somebody's backlog and making it all the way to the top. So, Tom, hopefully we have you in a better internet connection. Have you made it back to us yet?
I am back, I think.
Great. Yeah, sounds like you are.
Yes. Old school technology. I used a phone. So absolutely would echo what the other guys have said about getting friendly with the devs, getting them on your side. So from sort of an agency perspective, one, if you've got clients, go and work from their office. It sounds like a really obvious thing to say, but once you're in an office, you start to see the dynamics of who fits where into the organization, who do you really need to speak to get certain things done. And in terms of dev teams, go and see if you're able to sit in on their sprints or whatever it is. And often just by being present, you'll find that you can start to have more impact than you could have done when you were a faceless email coming into their inbox. We've had situations where we've had consultants just go and sit in sprints, and suddenly SEO tickets, which just languished, bubbled up to the top, even though the consultant didn't say anything the whole time. Just them suddenly being a real person who was really invested in the outcome of these tickets made those tickets float up to the top. And then find out what you can do to help the devs. Often there's tickets that they find difficult for certain reasons, and that doesn't get communicated back to you properly. But if you actually go and talk to them, you can find out, okay, they're struggling with these tickets for these reasons. What can we do to try to make these tickets more viable for them? And also, they often just appreciate that you've actually gone, spoken to them, recognized their challenges, and that just immediately buys you some trust with them that enables you to get things pushed through easier.
Sure. Well,
and then, sorry, quickly, because I cut out before, I didn't get to answer the question about the crawl budget stuff. Another thing I don't think was mentioned was just with at enterprise scale, log analysis is a huge thing that you can be doing for that sort of crawl budget question. I don't know if someone mentioned that whilst cut out, but
no, that's
there's a post by one of my colleagues, Dominic Woodman, who wrote a great post about how log analysis is much more accessible than you might think it is, and you can pull all of that into BigQuery and actually harvest a lot of actionable data very quickly for looking at these sort of crawl budget issues. And it's something that SEOs have sort of has fallen by the wayside as we've touched logs less and less in the recent years with having fancy analytics packages. We've stopped looking at logs, but logs are a gold mine.
Well, it's never been easier with the Screaming Frog log analyzer. If you don't feel like grepping your way into understanding logs, you can drag and drop them into the new Screaming Frog log analyzer, and you immediately have an ability to filter through some pretty actionable data. So it's something that if you've never done before, you really ought to give it a shot. So you'll be amazed what you can learn.
Yeah, often it's just convincing someone to give you the logs at enterprise scale is the hardest part, but all the stuff that we've all said about sort of embedding yourself into teams as much as possible will help with that as well.
Right. Well, and one other thing, I'm actually surprised you didn't mention this, Tom, is with the ODN, potentially bypassing the implementation cycle and taking charge of it yourself if possible. The first time I became interested in the ODN was when I was working with the client, and I was given access to their CMS after their backlog I was never making it to the top 6 months in, and they give me access to the CMS. I can't even remember what the name of the CMS was, but it was something ancient and terrifying that I'd never seen before. And I didn't know how to implement the changes I needed to implement. So that's when I became interested in the ODN, which the audience isn't familiar. It acts like a CDN, but it can actually change the content of the body or the headers or anything in between the user and the server, so that you are able to bypass essentially the old system. Is that a really botched explanation, Tom, or is that suitable?
No. That was a good explanation. As you said, it deploys similar to a CDN, and so from the user's perspective, they don't see that the platform's there, and it's like having a new CMS sat on top of everything else. And so often we see clients who have, as you said, a terrifying ancient CMS, just can't get certain things. You talk to them about structured data, and they're like, oh, we can barely change title tags. We can't possibly add structured data on, whereas the ODM platform will let you do that. And what's quite interesting is that, which is a lesson beyond just how great Distilled ODN is that we expected to have much more pushback from dev teams who would feel, we anticipated they might feel like a loss of control in being able to, like, we could now make changes to the site beyond their their level of control. And what was actually surprising was a lot of dev teams welcomed us being able to do that, because they were also very frustrated, and often that didn't come across in our communications with dev teams. They were frustrated about not being able to get certain things done, but it was just because the technologies that they were using, or sort of the legacy platform they were stuck with, wouldn't allow them to do that in an easy and accessible way. So we were frustrated because they didn't seem to be caring about our SEO tickets. They were frustrated because they couldn't do them, whereas having a platform that actually allowed us to not only implement changes, but also often test those changes beforehand and measure what sort of impact is this going to have. Dev teams actually enjoyed that. They're like, okay, we've got more data, and also you're able to help us with our mission, which is to make this website also as best as it can be.
Right. Yeah. So win all around if you can fight for that. Let's move on to question 3, which I think we've kind of touched on and ties into question 4. So I'd like to skip past this one, tie it into question 4, kind of answer together. But question 3 is, SEO often receives minimal recognition in the corporate structure. How do you fight for budget, sell value upstream, and earn priority? Kind of touched on this, but also within question 4, technical SEO requires collaboration across a variety of departments. How do you build interdepartmental collaboration? I think these things oftentimes go hand in hand and kind of tie into some of the making a case for yourself stuff we were talking about earlier. But let's lead off with Patrick, which I think this is an especially interesting question within the context of IBM.
Yeah, okay, so we got 2 questions in one. Recognition in the corporate structure. I mean, we've already talked about doing tests, case studies, predicting ROI. I would say the big part that's missing there is training. Training the different employees, the different teams. Enterprise SEO, believe it or not, we're working with far less SEOs per the size of the site than like even a small business would have. We're doing a lot with a very few resources. So training is essential. And the good part about training too is I found that it really finds people that get it. Like these people will be your evangelists. You need something done, you can't get it done yourself. Well, get this person to say, I need this done, and then get someone from another team to say, I need this done, and eventually people realize this needs to get done. You know, building up the trust, giving teams credit goes a long way. You know, if they've done great work, then give them the credit for it. You know, I'm not trying to win any popularity contests here, but really, if they've done a lot of hard work and they made the improvements you suggested, it's their win along with yours. As far as collaboration, you know, working with the teams repeatedly, building those relationships. Even at times we've had to help get teams budgets or just pay out of our own budget to get them the resources that they need to do a project. And I keep hearing backlog. You know, that happens quite often, especially if you're, I mean, internal agency doesn't matter. Just keep pushing. If there's something you think is really going to have an impact, don't give up on it. You just have to keep going. Find someone that'll listen. You know, go above, find an exec, find another team. Just figure out some way that it's not just dying in a backlog, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that really drives me nuts when that happens, and it happens frequently within our own agency, on other teams, on projects I'm not a part of, and even projects I am a part of as well. But I've found more often than not, if I do keep pushing, we can make it happen. If we get that adamant about it, it's like, you're paying me for this, and I'm telling you, I swear, this is very important. Eventually, the message gets across, but you know, it's. I think it really is important. You just don't give up and let it
Yeah,
backlog.
Tom made a great point earlier about agency people coming in. When they come in, I've been on both sides. I've been agency and in-house. When people come in, they typically get to meet the right people. You're getting the ear, and even, you know, this is from my experience at IBM. Even though you've said something 5 times to the same person, if an outside agency comes in and says the same thing, suddenly there's more buy-in. Like you just got corroborated.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. I've had people within organizations be like, "Thank you. I've been saying the same thing you're saying. We just needed somebody else from the outside to come in and say it again several times to us." That happens. Well, thank you for your answers on that, Patrick. I appreciate your transparency.
Yeah, no problem.
Paul, let's hear your thoughts on either or both of these questions.
Yeah. First of all, I love Tom's tip that he mentioned earlier about, you know, if you have an opportunity to go sit in a client's office and you know, build that face-to-face rapport with them, that's great. That's certainly going to help. But in terms of, you know, other things you can do, I think, you know, really, you know, knowing who you're talking to and speaking their language helps. You know, if you're talking to, you know, a marketing team, to business people, you're gonna want to be talking dollars and cents. Like, what is the end impact of implementing something? How is this going to be impactful? How is it going to actually affect their job? If you're talking to engineers, you need to speak their lingo. You need to understand the challenges that they're going through. What is impacting those backlogs? What are the limitations that they have, and how can you help them in those respects?
Sure. You know, I agree. That really is a great tip, going to the office. I've never thought to go work in another client's office. We've visited them and, you know, like taken them out to dinner, that kind of just typical stuff. Never just gone and worked in their office. That seems super smart. We've also invited clients to come to our office, and that, you know, they've been passing through Idaho for whatever reason. They visit our office and come work in our office. We really enjoyed that. Never gone to another office. That was a great tip. So Tom, what other great tips do you have for us?
So no pressure. So just to try and add to some of the things that Patrick and Paul mentioned. So one thing we haven't mentioned yet, which especially touches on question 3 in terms of getting recognition inside the corporate structure, is how you do your reporting is going to be really, really critical, because SEOs have a tendency to write big reports that sort of intermingle what needs to be done and why, and the SEO rationale with the payoffs. So something we try to do at Distilled in terms of doing better reporting is have like a reporting triangle. We've got a blog post, Better Business Documents is on our blog somewhere, and so basically, don't bury the lead. Talk about there should be in your email, in the subject, there should be like the top level what we're adding, but then don't just give them a massive Word doc. So 2 things we do is we create reports as slide decks. So even if you've got a big text-heavy report that goes with it, create a slide deck of the main high-level takeaways, how they're impacting the business, some of the metrics. Make it very accessible, very shareable, because that big text report is not going to get read by all the management levels. But if you give them a slide deck that they can whiz through in 60 seconds, that is far more shareable internally. That's the sort of thing that your point of contact can share with his manager, who might share it with his manager, and suddenly more people inside the business are exposed to exactly what you're doing for that business. Really important is, I think Paul used the exact phrase, speak their language. You should look at what are the company's strategic pillars, what are their goals. If they are doing like an annual report, what's the language that they're using? What language do they use on their website? And mirror that inside that deck so that everything you're saying links back to them in their own language to how it affects their business. Paul, I think, also mentioned link it to dollars, link it to revenue. It's all too easy for SEOs to get buried inside the idea that we're trying to get rankings or we're trying to get traffic. But once you go up a management layer or 2, they care about revenue and their strategic goals. So link everything to that. Make this very shareable document. And then like a more tactical level of the same idea, which plays more to question 4, is find out what each department's goals and objectives are, because they're often quite abstracted, quite away from what the business's goals and objectives are. But if you're trying to get other departments to collaborate with you, understanding what their goals are, understanding what their objectives are, and then when you're talking to them, talk about how this plays into their goals and objectives, and entice them to actually help you, and you're going to help them, and you're going to get this 2-way sort of payoff.
That's a really good point, to understand your contacts and your department that you're working with specific goals and tie your reporting directly into that. And that was a tip someone gave me at some point in my career, and I remember thinking, there's clients who we've never done that with, and then come to find out we're really not doing exactly the right strategy to accomplish their specific goal. We thought we were doing the right thing for a goal that thought we mutually understood, but what our contact was being held to, what they're getting bonused on, that metric was not the specific metric we were working to influence, but really it was the one we needed to be.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go.
I was going to say that's a great point. I mean, every department's going to have different goals: traffic, sales, engagement. Something that we've been trying to implement is actually a scorecard for improvements. So we did this. This was a big win. We had this impact, and then when it comes time for their goals, we can show we had these ideas that maybe didn't get done, and if they didn't meet their goal, well, that can easily be tied into kind of why, and now for the next quarter or the next year, they can go back and say, well, I really need to do this if I want to meet my goal and get my bonus.
Right. That can be motivation to actually move through the implementation cycle.
It's just
another
drop for.
Go on, Paul.
There's a great post by Rob Oosby, actually, from Distilled, 50 plus things you should learn about your client on the Moz blog. I highly recommend anyone dealing with this problem check it out.
Did Rob also write the junior technical SEO learning checklist thing on Moz?
No, that was Dave Sotomano, I think.
Yes.
The recent one.
Right, yeah.
So Dave wrote a recent one, Dave Sotomano, yeah, it was really, really good post. And it was absolutely something that people should, like, junior SEOs should be sat down and work through that list.
Yeah. Well, there are even a few things in there that, I mean, I guess I would consider myself a junior SEO. I've only been doing technical SEO a few years myself. But there were certainly things that I had not done in my career in that list that were educational experiences for me. So I definitely recommend checking it out. One other thing, Tom, that you mentioned that is interesting to me especially is sort of the triangle of reporting. In my mind, I've always seen it as three different types of reports you'll typically put together. One being all of the spreadsheets and data summary, that kind of thing. One being the potential of a slideshow for especially the upper level executives that are interested in the project but don't need the nitty-gritty, they want the summary. And then the long written report, so to speak, that's really in-depth and explains everything. And there's been times where I've done all three, but there's certainly been times where only one of the three really gets looked at. And as I've gotten to know my audience better, I typically only do one or two of those three items, understanding, or at least hoping to understand, trying to get an understanding of who my audience is and what they're really going to look at. Do you typically just always do all three, or do you kind of tailor your reports for who you're working with?
So what's really interesting is for the sort of text-heavy report, and I didn't mention this before, is that what we often do is make that a table rather than just heavy prose. So you can have different columns depending on exactly what the client's goals, objectives are, and who your point of contact is. But basically, you can have the recommendation in one or two sentences, and then you can have different columns such as like the rationale, the technical rationale, what needs to be done, what the impact might be. So you have 4 columns because the report is going to go around different teams, and different teams are going to be interested in different columns but might not be interested in other columns. The dev who might want to refer back to this report to see exactly what needs to be done might not care about what the rationale or the impact is. He wants to know what needs to be done. Maybe he does care about the rationale, but he doesn't care about the impact. And higher level execs, if you're not doing a deck to go with it, they might care about what's the impact of these changes, what's the rationale, but they don't need to know the technical details. And what happens is it makes the report far more accessible to different subsets of people because they can just quickly pass this document.
Right. That's an interesting point. I've certainly found that to be true as well. Most developers don't care why this should be impactful or why this issue is a problem. I just want to know what needs to be fixed and how. And so, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Well,
and then to actually answer your question, so you then don't need to do multiple different reports necessarily if you can build one in such a fashion that is accessible just for certain teams.
Sure. Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And I think there's still always going to be value to putting that kind of stuff into a slideshow where you're showing traffic graphs and fancy pictures because there's always, there's an audience where that's important. But I like avoiding that as much as possible because it's a lot of busy work on top of, I'd much rather as often as possible just do the work and then show the results because the work actually got done rather than a whole big presentation trying to prove it and why we should be doing this, etc. Sometimes it's necessary. So we have one last final canned question before we'll go into any audience questions. What do you love most about technical SEO? Patrick, let's have you lead us off.
Oh, I love this question. For me, I love that there's always a new problem. There's stuff that I've never seen before, especially at IBM. The scale we're doing on it, the people with varied backgrounds, experiences. There's a lot of legacy systems. There's a lot of new systems. There's a lot of, even though we have rules in place, they don't always get read or followed. So I've gotten to do a lot with like different JavaScript frameworks recently because the devs love it, even though they're not supposed to use it. So to me, it's just there's always something that I feel like I would never see anywhere else, at least here. But in general, there's just always something new.
I agree. That's one of the best things about technical SEO. Absolutely, it's rarely a dry moment. It's always some new puzzle to solve, riddle to unfurl.
Yeah.
So, Paul, what about you? What do you love the most?
Yeah, actually, technical SEO gets this reputation that it's very very sort of dry in some respects, but I actually find it to be one of the most creative areas of SEO, just because you're dealing with that that form of constraint and working within certain boundaries, and you're forced to come up with really unique solutions and solve problems in interesting ways. So for me, it's actually really like the creativity involved in technical SEO that does it for me.
Sure. Well, it takes a creative, outside-the-box type of thinking to approach technical problems and even understand what the problem is. I especially love it when a client comes to me and asks, we lost all this traffic, we don't know why, or we launched a new website. This is definitely my favorite, is when we launched a new website and it's just a new design, but we lost a bunch of traffic. It's like, okay, well, now we get to do the research to see what actually changed, what really changed technically about this website, and solving that problem, I think, is absolutely a creative activity. So, Tom, how about you? What is your favorite thing about technical SEO?
So I'm gonna to echo the same answer. I think it's just the solving puzzles thing, and it's the fact that often there isn't just one right answer. Often there is one right answer, but often it's we've got this answer, and then okay, we can't actually do that solution. It's not viable because of this reason or the problem with the platform or whatever. So then it's sort of okay, what's the next best answer? And so it's that creative thinking. How can we find what's the best trade-off point? And then another reason is because it's one of the areas of like marketing where, especially with like using a data-driven methodology, you can actually start measuring what your impact is in terms of, okay, we had this uplift, we did this, whereas for a lot of other forms of marketing, it's quite difficult for that to happen. And now you can say, okay, look, we brought this much more extra traffic, and that leads to this much more revenue, and you can actually see what you've achieved, whereas you can't necessarily with content marketing, direct marketing, these other channels.
Sure. Or oftentimes there really is more than one right answer. And then one of the other best parts about SEO, in my opinion, is the testing and experimentation. Running an experiment and seeing what works better, playing with the search engine, playing with this machine learning algorithm or set of algorithms, trying to figure out what's going to work best. It's fascinating to me.
Yeah, and you're optimizing towards Google's algorithm that's ever changing. What worked last year, you can't take that as fact that's going to work this year. You need to test it again. You need to measure it again. And because it's always changing, it means you can't just sit in your laurels. You got to be moving. I would hate to have a job where I'm just doing the same thing day out, day in for 30 years. Here, what worked a couple of months ago is no longer going to be the case. So you got to keep learning.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a really good set of reasons why technical SEO is amazing. Thank you, gentlemen. Well, we have a couple questions from the audience. We'll take a few more minutes to answer those and then wrap up this webinar if that sounds okay to all y'all. The first question here is, how do you handle massive inventory changes causing tons of 404s daily? Does anybody have any thoughts on that they'd like to share?
So I'm assuming that's e-commerce. I guess I would start with are the products coming back? I mean, if they're just 404ing because they're out of inventory, but they'll have inventory again next week, that's, I think, a different situation than it's just gone and maybe been replaced. In the case of the former, I probably wouldn't let those pages 404. I'd just show out of stock. In the case of the latter, if it's a ton, figure out you know, it depends on how many, but you might need to scale up your redirects or just prioritize them based on incoming links and internal and external, just to make sure you're not getting a ton of 404s.
Yeah, and I kind of have to wonder if this question is coming from someone in the audience that's getting a bunch of errors in Webmaster Tools, perhaps because these are soft 404s, which something I see pretty commonly in Webmaster Tools when there's a bunch of errors there. So it could just be an issue of maybe it's okay for these to be 404s, they just shouldn't be soft 404s. You need to make sure your server's sending a proper response.
This is another reason, again, for the log file analysis stuff, because that is data you can really trust. And as you said, with Webmaster Tools, Search Console, sometimes it's really difficult to know, is this data really trustworthy? And then acting on it and having a sort of reactionary approach can be really dangerous. And so you should definitely verify what's actually happening first.
Sure. Here's another interesting...
You may also want to...
Oh, go ahead, Paul.
Sorry. Just quick note. You may want to ask why is it 404ing? If it's intentional or not. I think it sounds like you probably want to reconfigure things so that it's not 404ing when something comes out of stock. And that's going to depend on whatever CMS you're using.
Right, and yeah, if it's just going out of stock, probably shouldn't be a 404. It's kind of vague if they're saying massive inventory changes. Are these products that are completely gone forever, or are they coming back? And that's really the deciding factor. So I got another pretty interesting question here from the audience. Is it advisable to have large CSS, JavaScript, etc. for a website to be in the footer so the page loads faster?
So there's two questions there, I think. Did you say CSS and JavaScript? So JavaScript should probably be in the footer, definitely. That's sort of standard best practice, and so for page speed, that's where it should be. I've never heard a good case for it having, like, beyond the page speed, for it necessarily having an impact on SEO. The bigger problem with JavaScript files in recent time has actually been that people are using third-party hosted JavaScript files, which are sometimes slower, so they're sort of pulling in like jQuery from a CDN, but oftentimes they're also blocked by robots.txt on that domain. And so if you do any sort of render with Google inside Search Console, you'll see, okay, it's actually being blocked and this page is not rendering. So you should always be verifying exactly what's happening, number one, inside Search Console.
Right. Yeah, and I had one interesting issue I had with having JavaScript in the head was with Search Console detecting the hreflang code below it. And so all the pages that had hreflang on it said in Search Console there was 0 pages with markup. And it was because of JavaScript that was above the hreflang in the head, and Google just couldn't pick it up. So we moved the JavaScript to the footer. That detected the hreflang, and it also made the fetch and render work properly as well, which was having its own issues because of the same problem. So that was kind of a weird one that I hadn't seen before.
That is interesting. I'd like to see that because that sounds weird.
Yeah, it was pretty strange, and that was the only change we did, is just moving the JavaScript from above the hreflang in the head to the footer, and then it was able to detect the hreflang. So we have one last question here. It's a pretty big one, so I think it'll probably take the rest of our time here. Haven't had a chance to work on anything enterprise level, and I'm relatively new to the SEO world. Biggest issue I'm seeing is finding accurate ways to measure results of changes and show those results to the client. So what is your advice to this woman, gentlemen?
It's really difficult for me not to sell everyone Distilled ODN right now. So what I'll tell people instead is that there's a whole bunch of different ways to be doing this sort of thing beyond testing. One of the interesting ones, I'll tweet out the link, is there's a blog post by a guy called Mark Edmondson, and he talks about using Google's causal impact library to help you assess whether a certain change you've made has had, what impact it has had. Because there's no bulletproof way to do it, certainly not if you're not using sort of an A/B test methodology, but Mark's written a really great tool that, so there's a blog post explaining how to use it, and then a tool that goes with it where you can just connect your Google Analytics account and it'll help you make an assessment of exactly what impact a certain change has had. I'll tweet that out on the hashtag right now. Beyond that, then more and more people are starting to use an A/B test methodology. There's a really great post by Etsy recently in the last couple of days. So there's a Pinterest one early last year, and they talked about it, and now there's been one by Etsy and talking about doing an A/B test approach and how that lets you actually test exactly not only what the impact is, but also you can test a whole bunch of titles and see which one works, a whole bunch of different changes, and see exactly which approach would be working best for you. I'll tweet that now.
Yeah, Etsy has an especially unique position to do so. I was researching wooden bottle openers the other day. So my little sister made one. She wants to start selling them. They're pretty cool. And like Etsy has wood bottle openers as a URL and wooden bottle openers as a URL. And at the time, they were testing like completely different approaches in terms of the different keywords they were targeting on very similar pages. Instead of cannibalizing one another, they're going. It was pretty interesting. But let's hear from Patrick or Paul or both of you on this how you measure results of changes and show those results to the client.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to depend on the scale. With smaller businesses, you just need to track what's important. If a lot of local businesses wouldn't have even like they wouldn't know numbers like lifetime value of their customer, but they have a lot easier time tying data in, whereas at the enterprise level, I mean, we use like several data warehouses and have to match up all the data from these different systems in order to really be able to track through the entire process. So just making sure that you have the data you need to track what you want to do. I'd say that's super important. If you don't know that this person converted and the sale was this and the average sale was this and the lifetime value of the customer was this, how do you really know what impact you had?
Sure. Yeah. It's I don't know if you've ever gotten down to the end of the road yourself and not had the right data, but that is not a fun place to be in.
Yeah.
So, Paul, let's wrap this up with your final thoughts to this question, and then we'll call it a day. How do you measure results of changes and show those to clients?
Sure. First of all, I definitely think the sort of A/B testing sort of methodologies are extremely undervalued within the SEO environment, and that's because they're a little bit hard to implement. But if you can figure out a good process for doing that within your organization, then I highly suggest that. If that's less feasible, then I mean you're stuck with looking at what changes were made, when were they made, when did Google pick up on these changes, when did the search engines pick up on these changes, and what was the impact of those? Did traffic go up? Did conversions on your website go up? And then you try to eliminate as many extraneous factors as possible, and sort of isolate it to changes you made, which isn't always easy, but you can do a decent job, at least directionally, saying that this change is a result of X or a result of Y. And just understanding that if you can't really do a fully controlled experiment, then this is the way you have to prove things, that directionally this is the impact of a change.
Sure. I think that's great advice. Well, I really appreciate all three of you joining me today, and your transparent answers is very, very gracious of you to share your wisdom with myself and our audience. We do have a few unanswered questions. We'll get to those over email. If you had an unanswered question, I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to it today. But thank you again, Patrick, Tom, Paul, for joining me today in this webinar, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you very much, guys.
All right, thank you. Toodaloo.